The wind howled through the towering pines, biting and fierce, as the woman huddled deeper into her thick fur-lined parka. Around her, the Alaskan wilderness stretched out in all directions, endless and unforgiving. Her breath formed clouds of vapor in the frigid air as she watched the fire crackle softly in front of her, the warmth from the flames barely reaching her frozen fingers. Beside her, the Huskies shifted restlessly, their eyes glinting in the glow of the fire. They were always alert, always watching. The quiet of the night seemed to press in from all sides, the only sound the whisper of the wind and the occasional rustling of the snow underfoot as the dogs moved about. There was a certain stillness to this place, a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. The woman sat cross-legged on the cold ground, her back pressed against a snow-covered rock. She had always found comfort in the isolation, the raw beauty of the wilderness. But tonight, something felt different. A sense of unease prickled at the back of her neck, and she glanced around, the hairs on her arms standing on end. The dogs were growing agitated, their bodies tense, ears flicking back and forth as they stared into the darkened trees beyond the clearing. She tried to ignore the tightening in her chest, pushing the discomfort aside. But then a low growl broke the silence. It was a sound so deep, so guttural, that it seemed to come from the earth itself. The woman's heart skipped a beat. The Huskies were on their feet now, their ears perked, their bodies coiled, ready to spring into action. She strained her ears, trying to listen, but all she could hear was the wind and the soft, rhythmic thump of her own heartbeat. Something wasn't right. The growl came again, closer this time, and she could feel the vibrations in her bones. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the trees, her eyes straining to see anything in the impenetrable darkness. The fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the snow. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then a shape moved in the shadows. It was large, too large for a bear, too low to the ground for a moose. Her pulse quickened. The Huskies were growling now, their teeth bared, their bodies low to the ground in a defensive stance. She reached for the small axe at her side, fingers trembling as she gripped the handle. The shape moved again, closer this time, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand straight up. Whatever it was not human, and it was getting closer. The wind picked up once more, whipping through the trees, but it did little to drown out the sound of the soft crunch of snow underfoot. The shape moved again more deliberately now. A low, eerie whistle seemed to carry through the air, almost like the sound of wind passing through hollow bones. The woman's heart hammered in her chest as she scanned the trees, her breath shallow and rapid. The Huskies were frozen, their hackles raised, their eyes wide, locked on the darkness. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to flee into the depths of the forest. But she knew better. To run would only make her a target. She remained still, clutching the axe, every muscle in her body coiled in tension. Then, without warning, the shape lunged from the shadows, and she barely had time to react. A large, hulking figure, with eyes gleaming like pale lanterns, darted into the firelight. It was a creature like nothing she had ever seen before, a massive, distorted form that resembled a wolf, but far too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. Its fur was patchy, matted with ice and blood, its mouth open in a snarl, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. The Huskies charged in unison, barking furiously, their bodies colliding with the creature in a blur of fur and teeth. The woman swung the axe in a desperate arc, aiming for the creature's side, but it was too fast. It spun away, its eyes narrowing, locking onto her. She could feel the cold breath of the beast on her face, its rancid scent filling her nostrils. Her pulse raced as she backed away, heart pounding. The dogs were still fighting, but she could tell they were struggling. This creature, this thing, was unlike anything she had ever encountered in all her years in the wild. Her mind raced as she frantically searched for a way to turn the tide of this battle. But the moment of hesitation was all it took. The creature lunged again, this time straight for her. It was as if time slowed, every second stretching into eternity. The woman raised the axe, but her arms felt heavy, like they were moving through water. The creature's claws grazed her side, and she gasped in pain, her vision blurring for a moment. The huskies screamed, desperate cries filled with terror, as the beast turned its attention back to them, but not before one of the dogs, a brave young male, lunged for its throat. The two collided in a frenzy of fur and violence, but the creature was too strong. The woman stumbled back, her breath ragged as she watched in horror. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there. With a burst of adrenaline, she dashed for the fire, grabbing a heavy stick from the pile of firewood. She swung it with all her might at the creature's side, feeling the impact reverberate through her arms. The beast snarled in fury, but the dogs took that moment to regroup, their growls intensifying. The woman's vision swam as she fought to stay upright, the pain from her side throbbing with every movement. But she could hear it, the sound of the creature retreating, its growls fading into the distance, the echoes of its terrible presence still hanging in the air. The woman collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The huskies circled her protectively, their heads low, their eyes scanning the darkness. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind, the crackling fire, and the faint, distant howls of the creature. It was gone. But she knew this night had changed everything. The woman sat in the snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body aching from the sudden surge of adrenaline. The pain in her side was sharp, but it wasn't enough to distract her from the overwhelming sense of dread that still hung in the air. She looked at the huskies, still alert, still watching the forest's edge with wariness in their eyes. They weren't just guarding her, they were watching for something more. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows across the snow. Everything felt off, like the world around her had shifted just slightly out of place. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the overwhelming silence pressed in like a heavy weight. She glanced at the dogs again. Their growls had softened, but they remained vigilant, their eyes darting to every rustle in the trees, every whisper of the wind. A deep, unsettling quiet had fallen over the wilderness, the kind that made every sound seem louder, sharper. It was a silence that was not natural, a silence that spoke of something watching from the dark. Her hand still clutched the axe, her knuckles white with the pressure, but she didn't dare lower it. The air felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped even further, and the fire seemed to be losing its strength. The shadows from the trees stretched farther and farther, inching closer to the warmth of the camp. The woman's heart thudded in her chest, its rhythmic beat a stark contrast to the eerie stillness around her. Suddenly, a sharp yelp broke the silence. Her head whipped around in alarm, and her eyes scanned the snow-covered ground. One of the Huskies, the young male, the one who had lunged at the creature, was now standing at the edge of the firelight, his head lowered, his body trembling. The woman's breath caught in her throat. There was something wrong. The dog's fur was matted with something dark, something that wasn't just snow. It was blood. The woman's heart skipped a beat, and she pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the pain in her side. She staggered toward the dog, calling his name, but the dog didn't respond. He stood there, his eyes glazed, his body shaking, as if in a trance. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted toward the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Her pulse quickened, and she called out again, her voice desperate, but it was no use. The dog was gone. The huskies around her began to whimper, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies tense. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, carrying with it a strange, faint noise, like the distant sound of something moving through the forest. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something larger. The woman's eyes darted from one side of the clearing to the other. Her breath hitched in her throat as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The creature wasn't done with them. It was out there, watching, waiting. And now it had taken one of her own. Her grip tightened on the axe, her muscles stiff and alert. The fire was beginning to dwindle, the flames flickering weakly, but the light it cast seemed to hold no comfort. She knew that something far worse was coming. The worst was yet to come. The wind howled again, but this time, the howl was different, more distant, but strangely mournful, like a cry of pain or loss. The woman's skin prickled as the sound lingered in the night, reaching into her bones. She strained her ears, trying to make sense of the noise, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. She felt the weight of the silence return, heavier now, suffocating. The fire sputtered, its flames shrinking, leaving only flickering embers in the cold air. Her eyes swept the clearing, every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. Nothing but the huskies, their bodies tense, their breath coming out in quick puffs, their eyes wide and watchful. Her mind raced. Could the creature be back? Was it circling them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again? She couldn't be sure, but the unease gnawing at her was unmistakable. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of ice in the distance, seemed amplified now, like the wilderness itself was closing in on her. The hairs on her neck stood on end as her eyes flicked to the edge of the clearing once more. There, just at the limit of the firelight, a figure appeared. A figure so fleeting, so quick, it almost seemed like a trick of the light. But she had seen it. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow stood motionless, its form shrouded in the darkness of the trees, blending so perfectly with the night that it seemed almost a part of the landscape itself. The woman's grip tightened on the axe, but her legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the snow. She tried to call out, but the words caught in her throat. The Huskies had already spotted it. They began to growl again, but this time it was different, lower, more desperate. Their eyes were fixed on the figure, their bodies trembling. The woman swallowed hard, the cold air thick in her chest. The shape did not move, not at first. But the longer she stared at it, the more she realized something wasn't right. The figure was wrong. It wasn't human, nor was it like the creature they had just fought. It was something else entirely, something darker. The woman felt her pulse thundering in her ears as the figure stepped forward, one slow, deliberate movement at a time. And then, with a terrifying suddenness, the thing broke into a run. Fast, too fast to follow with the naked eye. Before she could react, the Huskies lunged forward, snarling, their teeth bared, but the creature was faster. It vanished into the trees with a blur of motion, the sound of its footfalls muffled by the deep snow. The dogs circled, barking wildly, but the woman was rooted to the spot, her heart racing as the figure disappeared into the night. A cold, unnerving silence settled again over the clearing. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight, and she could feel the blood pounding in her temples. What was that? What had she just seen? She knew one thing for sure. The danger wasn't just outside the camp. It was everywhere now. The figure was still out there, and it wasn't finished with them. The cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones as the silence stretched on, suffocating and endless. The fire now barely flickered, its weak light casting long, trembling shadows across the snow. The Huskies, though still tense, had settled down, their bodies coiled but motionless, their eyes flickering nervously toward the trees. It was as if they too knew that whatever had just passed was not a mere creature of the night. The woman's breath came in shallow bursts, her chest tight with a cold fear that seemed to radiate from the very core of the earth itself. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, scanning the forest edge, but she saw nothing. No movement, no flicker of light. Just the oppressive darkness, thick and suffocating, waiting. Her mind raced, trying to grasp some semblance of logic, to make sense of what she had seen or thought she had seen. But there was no logic. Not in this place. Her fingers were stiff around the axe, and the pain in her side throbbed with every heartbeat, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. She had to stay alert. The fire dwindled further, and she moved quickly to gather more wood, her body stiff with the cold. Her breath clouded in front of her face, and every crack of ice beneath her boots sounded far too loud in the stillness. She tossed the wood onto the fire, the flames licking up greedily for a moment before it too began to weaken. The wind had stopped, leaving an eerie, unnatural calm in its wake. Her pulse hammered in her throat as she glanced at the Huskies again. They were staring toward the trees once more. The woman felt the tension in the air rise like a storm about to break. Then she heard it. A faint noise, too soft to place, but unmistakable. It was coming from behind her, toward the edge of the clearing where the trees met the snow. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like claws dragging against bark. Her stomach turned. The figure. It was back. The woman's breath caught in her throat, and she turned, forcing her stiff legs to move, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes scanned the dark horizon, the shadows beyond the firelight now swallowing everything. The scraping sound stopped. There was only the windless stillness again. The Huskies whined quietly, their fur bristling, but they didn't move. They were waiting. The woman's mind raced as she thought back to the brief flash of movement, the unnatural speed of the figure as it had disappeared into the trees. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a predator, like the first creature. This thing, this shadow, was something different entirely. Something far older. And it was getting closer. The sound of its movement was impossible to ignore now. A soft rustle. A low growl. The woman's grip tightened on the axe, her knuckles white, as she forced herself to step toward the edge of the firelight. With every step, the sounds grew louder, scraping, scratching, dragging against the snow. It was almost as if the earth itself was moving. Her breath came in ragged bursts as she reached the edge of the clearing, the cold biting into her exposed skin, but her focus was entirely on the darkened trees ahead. The shadow was close now, so close she could almost feel its presence, a weight in the air. The Huskies, still bristling with tension, growled softly, their bodies coiled, but they did not move. The figure had stopped, hidden once again by the thick trunks of the trees, just beyond the reach of the fire's feeble light. She could feel its eyes on her, heavy, burning eyes. And then it moved, a blur in the darkness. Too fast for her to see clearly. But she heard it, a screech that twisted the air around her, sending a shiver of terror through her entire body. The Huskies howled, but it was too late. The creature was upon them. The scream of the creature echoed through the clearing, sharp and guttural, its sound vibrating in the very air around her. The woman's heart slammed against her chest as the fire crackled, casting frantic, fleeting shadows across the snow. She had no time to think, no time to react. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as the figure emerged from the trees, its form now more distinct, more tangible than before. It was massive, twice the size of the creature she had fought earlier, its limbs long and spindly, draped in fur that was blacker than the night itself. Its eyes gleamed with a haunting, unnatural light, glowing like cold, distant stars. For a moment, the world around her seemed to freeze, the Huskies still and silent, their bodies taut with terror. And then the creature lunged. It moved with terrifying speed, its claws raking through the air, reaching for the closest target, the woman. She had no choice but to react. Her axe swung wildly, the blade cutting through the air with a sharp hiss. But the creature was faster. It dodged effortlessly, its long, bony fingers grasping for her, raking through the air with an unnatural screech. The woman stumbled back, her heart pounding, her chest tight with fear. She could feel the cold grip of dread tightening around her throat, but her body moved on instinct. The Huskies were charging now, leaping toward the creature with ferocity. They were smaller, faster, but not strong enough to stop it. One of the dogs was flung aside with a single swipe of the creature's claws, its body crashing into the snow with a sickening thud. The woman screamed, a raw, guttural sound, but it was drowned out by the growls and snarls of the remaining Huskies. Her body was moving, fighting, but it felt as if her limbs were made of lead. The cold, the exhaustion, the terror, it was all too much. She swung the axe again, her breath ragged, but the creature merely sidestepped her attack, its body slithering like smoke in the firelight. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The woman's breath caught in her throat. There was nothing human in those eyes, nothing that resembled the creatures of the wilderness she had grown up with. It was as if the creature was a part of the night itself, a living embodiment of the darkness. And then it moved. It was on her, faster than she could blink, its claws scraping against her parka, the pressure of its grip tightening around her chest. She gasped for breath, her body locking with fear as the creature pulled her closer, its icy breath searing against her skin. The Huskies were barking, their bodies writhing with fury, but they were still too far away. In that moment, with the weight of the creature pressing down on her, the woman felt helpless, trapped in the cold grip of something far darker than she had ever imagined. And then the creature stopped. For a fleeting second, it seemed almost distracted, its head tilting to the side, as if listening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to wrench free, but its grip tightened once more. But this time, it wasn't just her. The Huskies were closing in, their growls growing louder, their movements faster. One of them, her favorite, the bravest of the pack, launched itself at the creature's exposed flank, sinking its teeth into the beast's side. The creature howled in pain, its claws releasing the woman as it swung its body in retaliation. The dog was flung off with a brutal swipe, but it didn't stop. It charged again, this time with the others following close behind. The woman could hear the sounds of the struggle, the clash of fur, the screams of the beast, the desperate cries of her pack. In the chaos, she scrambled backward, gasping for air, her mind a blur of terror and adrenaline. For a moment, it seemed like the world had descended into madness. The fire, though weak, still flickered, casting just enough light to make the fight visible. The woman's pulse hammered in her ears, but she didn't stop. She could feel the cold, the overwhelming fear, and yet, deep down, there was a spark of defiance. She had survived this long in the wilderness. She was not going to let it end tonight. The battle raged before her eyes, the Huskies tearing at the creature, their jaws snapping, their bodies moving with an intensity born from pure instinct. The woman's heart thundered in her chest as she watched, every second feeling like an eternity. The creature was strong, far stronger than she had ever imagined, but it was faltering. The Huskies, though battered, were relentless. They continued to strike, their growls a chorus of fury and desperation, their claws scratching against the snow as they leaped and lunged. The creature howled in pain again, its eerie cry ripping through the air, but it wasn't enough to shake the Huskies' resolve. The woman's mind screamed for her to do something, to help, but her body was still shaking, frozen with the weight of what was happening. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her side aching, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. She knew they couldn't keep this up for long. The creature was regaining its footing. It twisted its body, flinging the Huskies aside one by one, its claws lashing out with deadly precision. One of the dogs yelped in pain, but it didn't stop. It rose again, its eyes wide with fury, its lips pulled back in a snarl. The woman's mind raced. She had to act. She grabbed the axe once more, her hands trembling but determined. With a shout, she hurled herself at the creature, swinging the axe with all the strength she had left. The blade struck its shoulder, deep and sharp, and the creature shrieked, a blood-curdling cry that sent shivers through her spine. But it didn't retreat. It whirled on her, eyes blazing with rage, its breath coming in ragged, cold gasps. In that moment, time seemed to slow. She saw the creature's claws raise high, its body coiling, preparing to strike. Her heart nearly stopped. But before the creature could strike, the Huskies charged once more, their bodies slamming into it, dragging it away from her with one final, collective effort. They tore at its flesh with an intensity that made the woman's stomach churn, their teeth sinking deep, their bodies pushing forward with primal strength. The creature howled again, this time in desperation, but it was losing ground. The woman, barely able to keep her balance, staggered backward, watching as the beast struggled against the pack. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the snow, and in the shifting light, the creature finally buckled. With a last furious scream, it collapsed to the ground, its body twitching once, twice, before going still. The Huskies circled around it, growling low, but they did not approach. The woman took a hesitant step forward, her hands still gripping the axe, her breath ragged. She couldn't believe it. They had done it. The creature was gone. But even as the adrenaline began to fade and the cold seeped back into her bones, a sinking feeling gnawed at her. The wilderness had claimed so much from her tonight. The Huskies were battered, their fur torn, their bodies shaking with exhaustion, but they were alive. They had fought with everything they had, and they had won. She sank to her knees in the snow, her body trembling uncontrollably, but she didn't care. The pack was alive. She was alive. For now, that was enough. But as she stared at the still form of the creature, she couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was just the beginning. The wilderness was ancient and unforgiving, and there were still things in the dark that had not yet shown themselves. And in the back of her mind, one question echoed louder than any other. What had that creature been? And more importantly, What else was out there in the wilderness waiting? The woman sat in the snow, her body trembling from the exhaustion, the cold, and the sheer intensity of what had just transpired. Her hands were stiff, her fingers numb from gripping the axe so tightly, but she couldn't bring herself to let go. Her gaze never left the fallen creature. It lay motionless in the snow, its massive form now a silent, twisted heap. The Huskies stood in a loose circle around it, their bodies still trembling, their eyes wary but watchful. They too had seen something that night, something that had changed them. The woman knew, deep in her bones, that they were no longer the same. Neither was she. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff, her breath coming out in slow, uneven puffs. The silence of the wilderness had returned, but it wasn't the same. It was colder now, heavier, as though the very air around her had become denser, filled with something unspoken, something that still lingered in the darkness of the trees. She glanced over her shoulder at the clearing they had just fought in. The fire was nearly out, the last embers flickering weakly in the snow. She needed to rekindle it to bring back some light, some warmth. But as she turned to walk toward the fire, her gaze once more drifted back to the creature. There was something about it, something off, something that gnawed at her like a warning in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the end, that the woods weren't done with them yet. Taking a deep breath, she turned back toward the fire, determined to keep her focus. But her heart raced as her mind returned to the question that had haunted her all night. What had that thing been? And why had it come for them? She knelt beside the dying embers and began to feed the fire, the crackling sound of the wood filling the air. As the flames flickered back to life, she looked up again, scanning the horizon, the trees, anything for any sign that the danger had passed. But there was nothing, just the darkness, stretching out endlessly in every direction, and the sense that something still lurked in it, waiting. The Huskies were gathering closer, forming a tight, protective ring around her, their eyes never leaving the edge of the trees. They knew. She felt it too. The fire crackled as it grew brighter, but even its warmth seemed to fall short, as if the wilderness itself was pushing back against it. She sat down, her back to the fire, and let out a long, slow breath. The pack huddled around her, their presence a small comfort in the vast, overwhelming darkness of the wilderness. For a moment, she allowed herself to rest, to close her eyes, to savor the warmth of the fire against her frozen skin. But even as she tried to quiet her thoughts, they kept racing. What had she seen? What had been that thing, that shadow, that strange, ancient force of nature that had come for them? She shook her head, trying to clear the confusion, trying to push the questions out of her mind. The fight had been won, and the creature was gone. But she knew that in the wilderness, victory was often temporary. The stillness, the silence, it was just a pause. She could feel it. The storm had passed, but the air was thick with the promise of more. Something darker, something deeper. And for the first time, she realized the true depth of the wilderness around her. It wasn't just the creatures. It was the land itself, the ancient, untamed land that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless beings. She wasn't alone here. Not really. There were forces at work in these wilds, forces that had no names, no form, no clear boundaries. And they were not done with her yet. But for now, the woman pulled her pack in close, holding her huskies tight, finding what strength she could from the warmth of the fire. She could feel her body growing heavier with exhaustion, but she kept her eyes open, watching the trees, the shadows, the ever-present night. It was silent again, except for the crackle of the fire. The fight was over, but the wilderness was far from finished. The fire crackled softly, sending fleeting shadows across the snow. But even as the warmth flickered in front of her, the woman couldn't shake the icy grip of unease that still clung to her. She had fought and survived, but there was something in the air, something that felt unnatural, as though the very land itself had grown restless. Her eyes scanned the trees once more, the dark silhouettes of the forest stretching high above her. The night was deep, and the cold bit at her exposed skin, but it wasn't the temperature that made her shiver now. It was the feeling that something was waiting. Something out there, beyond the edge of the fire's reach, watching. She glanced down at the huskies, their eyes glowing softly in the firelight, their bodies still tense, still on edge. They felt it too. The woman's hand slowly moved to her side, where the axe still lay within reach. She had no desire to fight again, not so soon after the last battle, but she knew better than to lower her guard. Not here. Not in this place. The wind had died down, and the world felt suffocatingly still. The kind of stillness that came just before something shattered the silence. The huskies whined low, their bodies quivering as they turned their heads toward the trees. A growl rumbled from one of them, low and deep, as if it were warning something unseen. The woman's pulse quickened. Her gaze flicked to the shadows at the edge of the clearing, but all she saw was the thick darkness of the trees, still and unmoving. And yet, she could feel it, the presence that lingered just beyond the firelight. She had been in the wilderness long enough to know when something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the feeling deepened, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Her breath caught in her throat.
She heard it then.
A faint rustling, far off in the trees, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the snow. The sound was distant at first, almost too faint to catch, but it was unmistakable. Her grip tightened around the axe as the rustling grew louder. It was closer now, and it wasn't just one creature. The woman could hear the distinct sounds of multiple movements, heavy, deliberate steps, as if a small pack was stalking the clearing, circling. She held her breath, listening. The huskies had gone completely still, their eyes wide and searching, their ears pricked up at the sound. They knew. The woman's heart pounded, each beat louder than the last. There was no mistaking it. Something else was out there. And this time, it wasn't hiding. She stood slowly, careful not to make a sound, her gaze still locked on the trees. The sounds were growing clearer now, unmistakably close. She could hear the soft scraping of paws in the snow, the low growls, the sharp inhales of creatures that were too close. Her muscles tensed as she raised the axe, ready for whatever came next. The air felt thick with anticipation, the entire world holding its breath, waiting for the first sign of movement. And then, from the darkness, something stepped forward. The woman's eyes went wide. It wasn't just one figure. There were several, shapes emerging from the shadows, moving silently but with an unsettling purpose. Each of them was tall, their bodies covered in dark fur, their eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The creatures from earlier had returned. Only now, there were more of them. They moved like shadows, their limbs long and spindly, their features hidden by the darkness of the trees, but their presence was undeniable. The woman could feel her heart racing in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She knew the danger was far from over, and this time there was no chance of retreat. The Huskies growled, their bodies poised, ready to charge, but the woman held them back with a firm, steady hand. She couldn't let them fight yet, not until she understood what these creatures wanted. The figures advanced, moving slowly but purposefully, as though they had all the time in the world. The firelight flickered again, casting the creatures' shadows long and distorted, making them seem larger, more menacing than they really were. Her fingers ached as she gripped the axe tightly, but her mind was clear. This was it, the final test. The creatures were almost within reach now, their movements silent, too silent. The woman could hear their breathing, sharp, heavy, like a predator's. But there was something else, something more sinister beneath the sound. A low, rasping whisper. It was too faint to understand, but it was unmistakable. The creatures weren't just here to hunt. They were here to communicate. And whatever they wanted, the woman knew one thing for certain. They weren't leaving until they got it. The whispering grew louder, carried on the still air, slithering through the trees like a dark thought. It wasn't words, at least not words that she understood, but it was unmistakable. A soft, unintelligible murmur that felt like it was scraping against her mind, pulling at her thoughts, trying to draw her in. The woman's grip on the axe tightened, but she stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. The Huskies were tense, their growls low and deep, their bodies quivering with the strain of holding back. The figures in the darkness seemed to move closer, their eyes gleaming in the firelight like twin stars, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. The woman's breath caught at her throat as one of the creatures stepped forward, its long, spindly limbs moving with a grace that defied its massive size. It was a moment before she realized it had crossed the clearing entirely, now standing just beyond the firelight. She could see it clearly now, a dark, tall silhouette, its face partially obscured by the shadows, but its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. The creature tilted its head as it regarded her, the strange whispering still lingering in the air. Her body tensed, every muscle coiled, ready to fight. But the creature did not advance. Instead, it made a low, guttural sound, almost like a breath, but not quite, and then something strange happened. Another figure, smaller but still formidable, stepped forward from behind it, followed by more of its kind, each one moving in a fluid, synchronized pattern. There were more than she had originally thought, at least half a dozen, maybe more, all of them surrounding her, standing just beyond the firelight, their eyes fixed on her. Her heart beat so loudly now, it felt like the entire wilderness could hear it. But she did not move. She couldn't. The creatures weren't attacking. They were waiting, their silent presence more unnerving than any attack could have been. The huskies whined, their bodies rigid with tension, their eyes darting between her and the figures in the dark. The woman swallowed, the taste of fear bitter on her tongue. What were they doing? What did they want? The whispering had stopped, but the creatures still didn't move. The woman tried to steady her breath, her mind racing through every possible scenario, every story she had ever heard about creatures in the wilderness, but nothing made sense. These things weren't like anything she had encountered before. They weren't wolves. They weren't bears. They weren't anything that belonged to the wild. And yet, they seemed familiar in a way, as if they were part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of this ancient wilderness. Her eyes shifted quickly from one creature to another, their glowing eyes unblinking, their forms almost blending into the night. And then one of them spoke, not in the raspy, incomprehensible whisper that had filled the air, but in a clear, low voice, a voice that didn't seem to come from its mouth at all, but from somewhere deeper, more primal. "You've survived," it said. The words were simple, but they sent a chill down her spine. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The creature did not answer immediately. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, and as it did, a strange pressure filled the air, like the weight of the land itself was pressing down on her. Her hands trembled, but she kept the axe steady. The creature stopped just beyond arm's reach, its glowing eyes fixed on her face. "You are here," it said again, its voice rasping, like something long forgotten. The air felt thick, as if every word it spoke carried with it an unspoken weight. The woman's mind raced. What did it mean? And why were they here? "What do you want?" she forced herself to ask, her voice steadier than she felt. The creature did not answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, as if considering her question, as if weighing her worth. For a moment, everything was still again, and the only sounds that remained were the gentle crackling of the fire and the soft shuffling of the huskies. Then, the creature's voice broke the silence once more. "We watch." The words were simple, but their meaning was anything but. The woman felt her breath catch in her throat, the realization settling heavily over her. The creatures weren't just watching her. They were watching them, the wilderness, the land, everything. And they were waiting for what she couldn't say. But the unsettling feeling in her gut told her that whatever it was far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, sending a flurry of snow into the air. The creature stepped back into the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly, and the others followed its movement. They had finished watching. For now. But she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The wilderness was not finished with her. Not yet. The creatures vanished back into the shadows, their glowing eyes the last thing to disappear as they melted into the darkness of the trees. The woman stood frozen, her body rigid with tension, every muscle alert. The Huskies, though visibly shaken, remained vigilant, their heads turning in every direction, their ears flicking at the faintest noise in the wind. She could still feel their presence, something lingering in the air, something thick and heavy that pressed against her chest. But there was no movement now. The silence returned, this time thicker than before, suffocating in its stillness. The fire crackled, the light casting eerie shadows across the snow, but it felt smaller now, more fragile in the vastness of the wilderness. The woman's breath was steady, though her heart still raced. What had just happened? What had those creatures meant by "we watch"? The words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over, their meaning slipping just out of reach like the last fragments of a dream. She knew they weren't ordinary animals, weren't like anything she had encountered before. They weren't there to hunt. They weren't there to fight. They were there to observe. And somehow, that felt far more terrifying than any battle. She tried to shake off the lingering feeling, to focus on the now, on the fact that the creatures were gone for the moment, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. Her hands were still trembling. Her thoughts still spun. The Huskies were still alert, their bodies tense as they circled closer to her, their fur bristling. They knew something was wrong, too. She reached out slowly, running her fingers through the fur of the nearest dog, the roughness of their coats offering a strange comfort. But even as she did, the unsettling sense of being watched didn't leave her. The fire crackled again, casting its orange glow into the surrounding darkness, but the woman knew it wasn't enough to keep the shadows at bay. She glanced around, her eyes darting from tree to tree, every movement seeming like a potential threat, a flicker of something just out of sight. And then she heard it again, that soft, distant rustling, the unmistakable sound of something moving through the snow. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The rustling grew louder, closer now, but this time it was different. It wasn't the slow, deliberate movement of the creatures. No, this was something else, something more chaotic, more desperate. Her gaze whipped toward the trees, straining to catch any hint of movement. The Huskies stiffened beside her, their eyes wide, their bodies coiled in readiness. And then, snap, a branch cracked loudly in the distance. Her body tensed, her hand instinctively gripping the axe again. The rustling stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the crackling fire. But she could feel it in her gut. Something was out there. Something else. She didn't know if it was another creature, a different threat, or if it was something entirely new, something the wilderness itself had sent to test her, to push her further into the unknown. The shadows in the trees seemed to deepen, and though the wind picked up, the air was still unnervingly heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then it came. From the darkness, a low growl echoed, vibrating through the snow and the trees, a sound so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. Her heart stopped. The growl wasn't from the creatures, no, it was something bigger, something more primal. The woman's eyes widened in realization. There was something else out there. Something far worse than she had anticipated. Her breath quickened as she watched the shadows shift once more. And then, from the blackness of the trees, two glowing eyes appeared. Bigger, brighter, far more dangerous. The woman's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. But there was no time for thought, no time to prepare. A figure emerged from the shadows, massive and looming, a dark silhouette against the night. It wasn't like the creatures from before. It wasn't even like anything she had seen. The beast was enormous, its body thick with muscle, its fur matted and dark as it stepped forward, its eyes locked on her. The growl rumbled again, this time louder, closer, and the woman knew she was facing something far more terrifying than anything the wilderness had thrown at her before. The huskies growled in response, but even they seemed dwarfed by the sheer size of the creature. The woman stood frozen, the weight of the situation pressing down on her, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She knew she couldn't face this alone. Not like this. But even as the huskies prepared to charge, even as the beast advanced, she couldn't help but wonder. Had the creatures from before, the ones that whispered, "We watch," known about this? Had they sent her a warning, a sign that she was not meant to survive this place? The creature stepped forward, its massive paws sinking into the snow with a thud. And then, just as it opened its mouth to strike, the woman's vision blurred, the world tilting as darkness began to close in around her. The last thing she heard was the growl, so close, so deafening, as the wilderness, once again, claimed its prize. The woman's eyes fluttered open, the world spinning, her senses sluggish and disoriented. The cold bit at her skin, but the warmth of the fire still flickered faintly nearby, a thin line between her and the darkness that had swallowed her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to sit up, but her body was stiff, every joint aching with the cold. She looked around quickly, eyes darting across the clearing. The massive creature was gone, no longer looming over her, no longer threatening to end it all in one fatal strike. But the silence was heavy. It pressed down on her chest as she struggled to stand, her legs wobbling beneath her, the ground beneath her feet soft with fresh snow. The huskies were close by, their bodies huddled near the fire, watching her with wary eyes, their bodies still tense, but no longer on edge. It was as if they, too, were waiting for something, waiting for her to understand what had happened. Her mind was foggy, but as she forced herself to focus, the memory began to return. The growl.
The beast.
It had been so close. And yet it hadn't struck. A chill ran through her as she realized what had happened. The massive creature had stood over her, its enormous form towering above her like a storm about to break. But it had stopped. She swallowed hard, glancing down at her trembling hands. Had it spared her? Or had something else intervened? Slowly, her eyes moved to the trees at the edge of the clearing. The shadows there, once shifting and dark, were now still, as if waiting for something else to happen. She could feel the weight of the land pressing on her, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt watchful. The land itself, as if it had made its decision. The whispers of the creatures echoed in her mind once again, but this time they seemed almost distant, faded, as if the air had grown quieter in their absence. The woman took a tentative step forward, the Huskies following her, their eyes never leaving the woods. Whatever had happened here, whatever force had chosen her survival, was still at work. And though she had been tested, she knew it was not over. She wasn't done with the wilderness, not yet. But as she glanced back at the snow-covered trees, she understood. There were things in the wilderness that were far older, far more powerful than anything she had ever known, and she was only just beginning to understand her place in this ancient, untamed world. The fire crackled behind her, the last embers flickering as if to remind her. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The woman stood there, her eyes lingering on the dark line of trees where the massive creature had vanished. The wind whispered softly through the branches, carrying with it a sense of quiet resolve, as though the wilderness had accepted her presence, and with it, the unspoken agreement that she had passed some unseen test. She let out a slow breath, the frost of the night air biting at her lungs. The tension in her body, though still present, had begun to ease. The Huskies, too, seemed to relax, their bodies no longer braced for an attack, but instead standing guard beside her in a quiet unity. For the first time since the terrifying encounter, she allowed herself to look around without fear. The snow beneath her boots, the way the firelight flickered and danced, casting long shadows against the darkened trees, it all felt different now. It felt as though the land itself had shifted in her presence, as though the wilderness had opened its vast, ancient arms to her, recognizing her as a part of its strange, untamable rhythm. She reached down to stroke the fur of the closest husky, its warm body a grounding presence in the cold night. There was no more fear in her touch, only a deep, humbling understanding of the wildness she had chosen to embrace. As she turned back toward the fire, she realized that it had burned lower, its embers glowing faintly, like the final, fading breath of a storm. She had survived the night, survived the wilderness that had tested her in ways she hadn't even understood. But the creatures, the watchers, the guardians, had left her to continue. It was their way. She understood now. They would not intervene unless they deemed it necessary. Her survival had been her own, but it had been witnessed, observed by forces beyond her comprehension. The Huskies curled up beside her as she sat near the fire, their warm bodies forming a comforting circle. The cold still clung to the air, but it no longer felt hostile. The wilderness was simply waiting. And as the last embers died out, she closed her eyes, feeling a quiet peace settle over her, knowing the wilderness